Retro.
Are you an aspiring Jedi, or do you dabble with the dark side of the Force?
Regardless of whether you fancy yourself a defender of the light or an aspiring Sith Lord, you're going to need a lightsaber.
Podcast Stardust is pleased to partner with Saber Masters, the creators of high-quality, durable, and affordable lightsabers.
Saber Masters is preparing to launch the Ultimate Lightsaber 2.0, and right now you can get 2 for the price of 1.
So, check out the link in our show notes and go get your Ultimate Lightsabers from Saber Masters.
And don't forget to use our referral code Stardust to save $10 at checkout.
And each purchase using our referral code helps support Podcast Stardust.
Hi, this is Vanessa Marshall, voice of Hera and Rook Cast, and you're listening to Dennis and Jay on Podcast Stardust. Their behavior is continually unexpected.
Hello, and welcome to Podcast Stardust. This is the fully armed and operational podcast dedicated to Star Wars news, reviews, and discussion. I'm Dennis Keithley.
And I'm Jay Krebs.
And our series celebrating the 25th anniversary of the Phantom Menace continues with this week. But before we start that, Jay, this is a good time to remind everybody where you can be found online and around the internet.
All right. We can always be found on Facebook, Instagram, and X at Podcast Stardust.
All right. The dish is aligned. The signal is boosted to maximum output. The shield is down. We are now broadcasting to the galaxy. So before we dive into discussion, it occurs to me, I'm not sure that we've always reminded everybody what we're doing here. And we do have new listeners that join the podcast from time to time.
Mm-hmm.
But for the past few years, we've been picking a movie that is celebrating an anniversary that usually ends in a 5 or a 0. And then we break that movie down into 11 or 12 parts, looking at 10 to 15 minutes of that movie at a time. And we do one of those per month. This is the 5th segment that we are doing on the Phantom Menace. And it covers the portion of the movie after they've come up with a plan to enter Anakin into the pod race, and right up until the pod race is about to start. And so we got a lot of negotiations going on with Watto and stuff like that. But I love these series that we've been doing, Jay. They're always a lot of fun. We get deep into the details sometimes, or some of the philosophical or psychological discussions about the characters. And we've had a lot of great guests for these.
Oh yeah, I've treasured these segments for sure. And so just want to say, hey, and welcome to our new listeners out there. And the guests that we've had, as you said, just always bring such a wonderful, fresh perspective. And it allows us to, as you said, dive into the psychological and the sociological and, even the political and all kinds of different things. And it's just so much fun to bring everyone's knowledge into these segments.
Indeed. And we got a returning guest for this, and we were having a fun for us, probably more aggravating for him, conversation about plumbing leading into this. Is just making me laugh now. But
adulting,
yeah. So with no further ado, let's go ahead and get into that discussion. So we are honored and pleased to welcome back to Podcast Stardust, Greg McLaughlin, host of the Rebel Base Card. Greg, I hesitate to ask how you're doing based on the pre-recording conversation we've had. But how you doing this evening?
I hope you didn't kill anyone I know for this podcast. All right, I got one Watto in me and I'm done. That slays your voice. That kills your voice.
Oh, wow. Okay, I should have recorded the earlier conversation.
No, it beats talking about my sink, for one. Yes, nobody out there wants to hear about my sink. No.
Oh no.
Well, welcome back. We're very pleased to have you here on Podcast Stardust. Before we get started, you've been here before. Why don't you tell everybody just a bit about the podcast and where they can find you?
Well, when I'm not trying to chase under my sink, we are talking about cards collecting, and very much lately we finished up Bad Batch. I brought in my co-host for that, Greg Cass from islandcannon.com, and we went through that, and then we were in the middle of doing Tales of the Empire when vacations happened, and then after that, we will really jump right back into Acolyte, kind of like everybody does. It's amazing how these shows kind of come like an uninvited guest. They come into your life, they suck up everything you have, and then they leave, and you're just like, what just happened? So, after, I think once we kind of get settled in the summer, I really want to tackle 25 years of Phantom Menace cards, because that's kind of what my job is, right? I'm the one that talks about cards when I can, in between Disney Plus shows. But that's kind of what's been going on. But just been kind of listening to everybody kind of talk about Bad Batch, and which was great. And then just kind of following along. You brought me in last year for Return of the Jedi, like the little doing these little pieces, and I was really happy to get the call back up to the big leagues and do this one, because I like how you guys are doing this, and it's a fun podcast, and you're so regimented. You really have got this whole schedule thing together, and so I'm always just a little envious of how you guys just kind of roll and do so many shows. So very happy
It's
to be
all
here.
Dennis. It's all Dennis. He keeps me going, that's for sure. I
I
still have
like
to
to talk
find
Star
my
Wars.
return. Oh, yes, for sure. I still have to find all my Return of the Jedi cards. We had talked about that last time too, and that was an assignment that I failed, so I need to do that. But it's hilarious because you can tell that the hosts of this podcast, as well as our guests, are of a certain age because we lament over syncs.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
it's all
Yeah.
good.
Yeah, it's
quite the
amazing.
plumbing issue.
Yeah, 20 years ago, we're all like, hey, man, you going to Lollapalooza? And now it's like, oh, thank God there's no drip under my sink. The bar is really low now for what makes me happy. And what makes me happy is a dry kitchen cabinet.
I
Oh,
hear that. I hear that. That
same.
hits. All right. Well, we are beyond thrilled to have you back. I was excited that you were able to make this, and we're very excited to talk some more Phantom Menace. This has been a great year to talk about that. But we have, before we get into this segment, we have our questions we ask our guests. Jay, you want to go ahead and kick that off?
Oh, yeah, I would love to. All right, Greg. So the first question that we have for you is to tell us about your first experience seeing the Phantom Menace. So do you remember where you saw it, who you were with, initial reaction? You're already giggling, so I'm assuming that there's a great story behind this. So take it away.
Yeah. I was still in Saipan, so I was still in the Pacific when this came out. And Saipan at that time, or the Commonwealth, the Northern Mariana Islands, at that point had the one screen theater for a good chunk of. They wouldn't get this big, mega screen thing until later, and so it had changed hands. It had been closed down during a typhoon one year, and so a person that we knew was running the theater at the time, and they had a private screening for when Phantom Menace came out.
Wow.
And me and what would be my best friend, and Travis Coffin, we what I guess would only amount to what you call pregame. Now we pregame Phantom Menace in the 20s, right? And so I remember we got there, and then they had a bunch of complimentary booze, and so we went right. And then it was not gonna. I don't think the movie was gonna be for another 45 minutes, and so everybody basically just had nothing to do but continue drinking, continue the party. And so by the time I was really flying by the time we got in there. But I remember through the haze before I passed out, I remember how excited I was because I was seeing new Star Wars for the first time since I was a kid, and I just remember I'm like, Travis, I'm like, I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know what's going to happen. And I'm so excited. And the second time, I remember enjoying the movie a lot more. But I remember waking back up. I saw most of it the first time. But
Oh,
what I
man.
would say, and not to bring it down, my friend is no longer with us, but it's
Yeah.
one of the best memories that I have, and it's always something that's been fun to talk about. On my show and other shows, talking about the Phantom Menace, is that having that time with him and just going there. It's like seeing it with friends. Right now, we would expect to go with the people we've met or in the Star Wars community, and whether we can go to Celebration. That's kind of what it was. Kind of my first inkling of seeing something like this. It was not with a family member. I've dragged my family to many, many films, but this one was with somebody who was just as excited as me to see it. And in the theater, everybody was having a good time. And that's what I kind of might take away from it. And, we can get to the stuff that you liked and didn't like later. But that is, to me, the memory that makes it, and that's what makes it special. I can't believe it's 25 years now.
Oh, I know. Same. And I'll tell you what, I think you definitely have the award for the most unique experience thus far. That's for sure.
I love that story. That's
Yeah.
fantastic. That's That is that's different than anything we've heard on any of the movies we covered here on Podcast Stardust.
For sure.
All right, well, let's follow that up with what is your favorite scene from this movie?
Boy, and I would probably say it would have to be, somewhere in the Duel of the Fates. I really loved the battle between Obi-Wan and Darth Maul, and I think it's when he gets through and you really see him going and the sabers going back and forth, and they're kind of doing, this kind of a martial arts fight. And I just remember that it was stunning because you never saw anything that fast. It's kind of like the only thing I can think of, Dennis, is kind of like when you watch the Cowboys of the 70s and you got Staubach there, and a lot of it's all that NFL films and they're all going in slow motion. Then you see like Troy Aikman and Emmett Smith and all those guys, and it's like, I've never seen anything so fast. That's kind of like how it was. You went and saw like, here's Alec Guinness and David Prowse kind of tink tink tink, and now you're seeing this and you're just like, this is amazing. So I would have to say it's what I always look forward to seeing, because I know that I'm just really going to like the moves and how the choreography of it. And when you go back and watch the making ofs now and you see them, him and Ray Park kind of going over and over again, that's what makes it for me.
Oh, for sure. Oh, that's a good one. Always. So, springboarding off of that, who would be your favorite character in the Phantom Menace?
I can tell you who it's not. I'm gonna throw an audible and say it's not Boss Nass. Not one of my favorites.
Fair.
Glad we didn't have you on last time.
There was a lot of Boss Nass. Yeah.
A lot of Boss Nass. A little bit of Boss Nass goes a very long way. That's a tough one. I really liked Ewan McGregor in this, and I think he's probably the character. I think he's probably the character in the performance. I think we all, at least for me, I like. It's consistent, and I've liked ever since. I think, regardless of what I thought at the movie at the time, and what I've kind of grown into, I've really grown into it over these years, especially since kind of like rejoining the community. But I would say that consistently, I like. This is why you have me on English. But
Like
his
Yoda.
performance, Ewan's performance, I like, and which makes it all better when when he pops up in Anaheim at Celebration, and he gets on the Celebration live stage, and you're just like, yeah, man, this is the guy. This is the guy right here. But yeah, I would have to say Obi-Wan.
That's fantastic.
Hard to beat indeed. Okay. Well, then let's dive into this segment, and we'll be discussing the portion of the film that runs from 44 minutes, 14 seconds to 55 minutes and 2 seconds. So we've got a lot of stuff that leads us right up to the pod race in this. And we start off in Mos Espa, and Padme kind of confronts Qui-Gon by saying that she doesn't like this plan. The Queen's not going to approve. And then Qui-Gon's response is, the Queen doesn't need to know. And then she kind of sits down and huff and says, well, I don't approve. Greg, I've been asking this of a lot of people, and Jay and I've had conversations about this. When you went into the Phantom Menace, whether it was the first time or the second time.
Second time, much better.
Yeah, I love that story. I'm going to remember that one forever. Did you already know that Padme was in fact the Queen? Or do you remember?
I don't think that I was confusing them. Mm-hmm. I think I picked up right away. Now, the Keira Knightley has kind of her role in it really has been more of a recent, like, oh, that's who that was, because I didn't really give much of the others. And I guess Sophia Coppola is one of the handmaidens as well. But I don't think I was really confused. I maybe been a lot of other things that night, but I don't think I was confused that was Queen Amidala and Padme. Although now I can look back and go, okay, now the makeup makes a little more sense because it kind of blurs that, and they kind of look alike. Although I don't know who she's really fooling. Mm-hmm. I think it falls a little bit when they go back and ask Boss Nass and them for help, and they have to, oh, this is my decoy, and I go, did we really need to see that? But I would say that no, I wasn't really under the impression. I thought they were one and the same.
Okay, yeah, cool. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, to me, Qui-Gon always knew that this was the Queen, and that Padme didn't realize that she wasn't fooling anybody. But Jay, I know you and I have talked about this a bit, but just as a refresher, what's your thought on that?
Well, the funny thing is Greg, I know whenever I'm in cosplay and then I'm out of cosplay or vice versa, people still do recognize me. And sometimes I'm taken aback by that because I'm like, how can you possibly realize that that's who I am. But this is kind of the same kind of a thing. And so, I think I kind of always knew that she was one and the same because my son and I actually had this conversation as well because he was, of course, little when he first saw this. And when we saw it in the theater again here just not too long ago, I asked him, I said, "Did you realize that Padme was the queen and vice versa?" And he said, "I think as a little kid, I didn't realize that."
Hmm.
So yeah, I mean, and of course he was little at the time too, but I'm pretty sure that I always did. Yeah. So what about
Yeah.
you?
Well, it's just that I remember the marketing being around this, that Natalie Portman had been cast as
And maybe
Luke and
that's
Leia's
why.
mom.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so we didn't have the social media then that we have today, but there was
Right.
still plenty of Star Wars fan sites on the internet. There was still plenty of rumors going around, the tons of reporting about the first Star Wars movie that was coming out after Return of the Jedi. And so I don't know if that was any big secret. It's one of those things that I wish maybe they had done a bit better job, like the way they did with Rey in The Force Awakens, not giving so much exposure to exactly what that role was. So it would have been nice if we had had that kind of protected a bit more as a secret going in, but it is what it is. It's kind of like knowing that Count Dooku was going to wield a red lightsaber in Attack of the Clones. Some of these things you just know in advance. So then the scene picks up in Watto's shop, and this is where we're getting the negotiation of how they're going to enter the race, who's going to pay for the race, and the like. Watto then asks how Qui-Gon will sponsor Anakin, and Qui-Gon's response is, "Well, my ship is going to be the entry fee." And then Watto then points out, "Well, what's Anakin going to ride? He smashed up my pod in the last race." And then so Qui-Gon comes through with this claim that he's acquired a pod in a game of chance. And then the initial proposal is that Qui-Gon will supply the pod and the entry feed, and that Watto will then supply the boy. And then they'll split winnings 50-50, to which Qui-Gon counters, "You supply the entry fee, and if they win, you keep all the winnings minus the cost of the parts that I need, and if you lose, you keep my ship. Either way, it's a win-win." I've been really interested in the course of the series that we've been doing here when it comes to Qui-Gon about Jedi ethics in this case. And he's a bit duplicitous in this because, he doesn't reveal that Anakin actually built this pod. And, later we're going to see him influence the roll of the dice when this all comes. Jay and I've had an opportunity to talk about this a bit in previous installments, but Greg, what's your take?
Well, I mean, it's fairly consistent because before he tried to get, Watto to say, "No, you'll take Republic credits, it'll be just fine." And so you can see him bending the rules. And I think you're it does kind of get set up to where, he doesn't always kind of follow, and he kind of goes by his own drum. Um, but it's interesting that now when I look back at the scene and you're going through all the negotiations, you're trying to keep up with what he's saying. He's like, "All right, well, I'll use no, like, actually, here's what's going to happen." And they kind of change the plan as it goes along. It's almost like akin to at the end of this particular segment that we're going to talk about, where they're talking about like the pod versus, how much a pod's worth. And then interestingly, I was like the Cantina cast, they were doing like the deleted scenes, and there's an extended conversation between Watto and Qui-Gon over that, and some of it sort of like makes sense, some of it props up the argument they're having, and others it's sort of like, yeah, you can kind of let go. But it is interesting that he's going toe to toe, and he doesn't, he's certainly not Mr. Goody Two Shoes, and it's kind of like what I like about him, just because he just like, no, this is what we got to do. It's not the Republic, man. We Jedi a little differently out here.
We Jedi. I like that. Yeah, it struck me that even in this little segment that he's told basically 3 lies, if not more, because he even straight out says to Padme, "Well, the queen doesn't have to know." And that's even though he was goading her, I mean, it was still dishonest in a way. And then this scene, and then as we just said, the dice rolling scene or die rolling scene. So yeah, the ethics of Qui-Gon, he's such a rogue.
Yeah, I know. Don't get me wrong. I love Qui-Gon. I think he's
Oh
an
yeah.
amazing character. I think Liam Neeson did a fantastic job with this role. I love how he is very observant in this movie, and he's keeping everyone on toes. He preys on everyone's expectations in this movie frequently, especially Watto's, to get what he wants, and so I like it. But still, there's just this notion that he already tried using a Jedi mind trick on Watto, and now he's preying on Watto's greed, and he's using deception. Some of them are, as you put, Jay, outright lies, and sometimes are omissions of fact on this, in this situation here. And then later we'll see him use the Force to his advantage again. So, anyways, but just put a pin in that for a second. So Qui-Gon has a conversation with Obi-Wan over the communicators. We get a shot of the Queen's ship with a number of dewbacks in the desert there, and then Obi-Wan asks, what if this plan fails? A ship without a power supply, and then Qui-Gon's response is, a ship without a power supply isn't going anywhere. So that demonstrates the pragmatic side of Qui-Gon's like, well, what do we got to lose? Because Obi-Wan's concern is that, hey, if you lose this, we could be stuck here for a real long time. It's like, well, we're not going anywhere. We'll still have to protect the Queen in this situation. But this really just gives me an opportunity, Greg, to kind of talk about, or ask you really, what do you think about the relationship between Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan in this movie?
I think it kind of, to me, it always kind of starts off. I remember Obi-Wan, after they escape the droid ship, or they're getting ready to escape the droid ship, and he says, negotiations were short. Kind of showing a little bit of like, a lot of it can be pretty stiff, but he'll sneak in a joke every now and then. And, because Qui-Gon takes it, pretty serious. But what I would say is that it's definitely clear. It's like, it's Qui-Gon's way or the highway. That there's not too much that they probably really, I don't think he loses too many debates with Obi-Wan on it. But I just thought during that, let's not gloss over the fact, and you guys have probably mentioned the Bic Razor communicator.
Oh yeah, I had one of those.
Or exactly what were the pilots, the pilots that they brought along with them? What are these guys doing? Can no one else forage for food or parts or whatnot? I mean, it's a shame that I'm watching them in the background and they're doing something that looks, and you're just like, what are you guys playing? Like, a hungry hippo or something? Where it's like, what is that? What is that thing?
Exactly. I was thinking the same thing when I was watching it this time.
Like, what is it? What's happening? But it isn't kind of interesting that it's just, there's definitely, and with the midi-chlorian count, even later, when you're sitting there going, why is this public knowledge that everybody knows what count everybody has? I don't want to skip ahead, but I'm still kind of like, how do we know that Yoda has this or whatnot? I'm like, what good could that do anybody in a place where it shouldn't be as competitive as it is? But then again, everybody knows. But anyway, you can tell that they've been doing this for a while. They're very comfortable. It's kind of like when we visit Anakin and Obi-Wan in Attack of the Clones, and they've already kind of been through a bunch of adventures off camera, but they're very comfortable with each other's skin. That's where these two are. But there's still that, like, unlike Anakin and Obi-Wan, where they were more brothers. This is definitely like a father type and a mentor type. This is Bruce Wayne and young Ward. Dick or something like, okay, that's right. Can't remember. Dick Grayson, yeah. So
okay, very good. So now we get a scene between Qui-Gon and Shmi, and this is while Anakin's preparing his pod racer for the Boonta Eve Classic, and Qui-Gon starts talking to Shmi about Anakin and says, you should be very proud of your son. He offers help with no thought of reward, and Shmi's response is, well, he knows nothing of greed, and Qui-Gon is trying to tread into the ground about Anakin potentially being Force proficient. And so he says, he appears to have special powers. He can see things before they happen. That is why he appears to have such quick reflexes. It's a Jedi trait. And that's the conversation between Qui-Gon and Shmi. And they would have identified him early in their public. So he's kind of made up his mind before he even gets to the blood test that comes up later in this segment. And this is when he asks, well, who was his father? And Shmi's response was, there was no father. She carried him, she gave birth to him, she raised him, but she can't explain what happens here. Jay, I'm going to start with you this time. What do you think about this conversation? What do you think about the relationship between Qui-Gon and Shmi and this revelation about the origin of Anakin?
Okay, I've been looking forward to talking about this all day long. I'm not gonna lie. So, I just think that with Shmi, she was basically reaching out for help. I mean, she wanted the best for Anakin. She saw this opportunity in Qui-Gon that, she knew that Anakin was special and she knew that there was something different about him. And just from her experience of like, oh wow, I'm having a baby and here we are kind of thing. And I've had so many conversations with different people as far as, what is this like immaculate conception kind of thing and how did it happen and whatnot. So I'm going to throw this out there that of what I have recently heard, and I kind of think it's sort of dope, but it's basically that Plagueis did this to Shmi somehow
Mhm.
and did this so that he could create life and so that he could create the perfect apprentice that would overthrow Palpatine and then eventually overthrow him. But he wanted that because he wanted the strongest Sith ever. And then along comes this Jedi just Jediing as he does and just messed up the whole thing. Thoughts?
Well, do you remember the Vader's Palace comic arc that Charles Soule wrote that you and I discussed previously on this podcast?
Yes.
There was the suggestion there that Sidious was responsible for Anakin. And since then, Pablo Hidalgo and others have kind of walked back how definitive that may or may not be. But there is that possibility. What do you think, Greg?
I've I've never been exactly, I wouldn't say happy or thrilled with that, but I prefer to kind of think of Anakin to Palpatine as more of an accident slash opportunity,
Mm-hmm.
because that way it wouldn't necessarily mean that everything has to always be connected. Sound familiar, sequel trilogy? But what I would say is how surprising over the years that the Immaculate Conception, that's just a good way to put it, is so rarely talked about, or at least
Hmm.
I think if I was in front of the Jedi Council, I would have led with that because I'm like, you believe it's this boy? No, dad. Okay. And then, like, I think, hey, walk it back, Mace. Let's just kind of talk. Let's just go over this. But it kind of gets glossed over, I think. Now, I mean, obviously, anybody will pick up a thread. And I think you're right. I've heard kind of the same things when talking about that. And I think that makes it like a nice, neater bow. And sure, if he's learning from Plagueis and they can kind of play with the midi-chlorians. Okay, feasible, but I don't necessarily think I need it to be connected. But it would kind of explain why Palps goes by and going, yeah, we'll watch your career with great interest. Bye.
Sure.
With not Samuel L. Jackson in the background. I won't get to say that later. But just that's the stuff I look for when I watch this movie now.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm just surprised. In the movie, it doesn't get as much play as it probably should. But then again, maybe there's other races that, this is more perfectly normal.
Well, I think with the Phantom Menace too, there's so many things in this movie that's just like a one and done. And like you
Mhm.
said, nobody really talks about it. We talked about the Force run that no one ever does anymore. And here's this Jedi Force power that it's just like zoom, and then no one ever does that ever again. So there's that, there's this. I'm still perplexed at the whole how in the heck did they send a blood sample through a disposable razor to be analyzed kind of thing.
Well, put a pin in that. We'll get to that scene in just a minute. But
Called email attachment.
yeah, so yeah, I think one of the challenges facing George Lucas here is that he had an original trilogy, and then he started that at 4, or he went back
Mhm.
and labeled that episode 4, and then we got 5 and 6 later. So he really gave himself 3 movies to try and tell an entire story that might have been able to be told in like 4 or 5 if he really wanted to. But when you then go back and start with episode 1, well, then you're kind of dealing with a limited amount of time because 3-hour movies were not really a thing at that time. You weren't going to get away with that. 2 hours and 15 minutes, 2 hours and a half, or about as long as you could push. So I could kind of see a lot of these things that we noticed that, well, whatever happened to, they were necessary sacrifices when it came down to it in the grand scheme of the story that they had to tell over the sequel trilogy, or the prequel trilogy, when it comes down to it. But it is fascinating, yeah, that we have an Immaculate Conception it's one of the things that really piques Qui-Gon's interest here. And as you said, Greg, it never comes up again. I mean,
Nope.
zip, throw away the key, though we're done with it. But all right, well, let's move on. This is followed up by Anakin working on the pod, and all of his friends, quote unquote friends, arrive. And Kitster notices R2D2 and is really impressed with that. Says, "You're so lucky." We get George Lucas's daughter there in the group. And one of the boys there is like, Anakin's like, that's not the half of it. I'm in the Boonta, and he's gonna race. Kitster's like, I don't in this. This is like a piece of junk. And then that little redhead kid's like, you're gonna race in this. You're gonna be in a bug squash. So come on, everybody, let's go play ball. So not the most supportive little friend group. They all kind of run off and leave Anakin and Kitster behind. What'd you make of all that, Greg?
Yeah, well, apparently it takes more than a couple of twin jet engines to really, to impress, other maybe lower middle class, scrub kids. Like, all right, this ball's cool. Or how about this thing that's, revving, it's making a noise halfway around the block. But yeah, it's nice to finally learn later on that that's Lucas's daughter. I'm like, okay, that's cool. And in the future she would have in this universe. But yeah, the kind of the portly Rhodian, which I guess is Warwick Davis.
It is playing Wald.
Also cool. Hadn't known until not that long ago. But yeah, it's one of those where I think there was also another extended scene or deleted scene where they come back and the pod is painted. Anakin is wiped out on there, which doesn't jive with how it was cut and told to go inside after the midi-chlorian test. But I think it would have been interesting to see a little more time with the pod. Because I just love how practical and all the buttons and the flips and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, it's also one you kind of go, okay, as you kind of go through and, moving on, right?
Definitely. Jay, Kitster becomes a character here for Tatooine, and we see him pop in and out. Qui-Gon says his name even, once or twice and all this. I remember, like, after this movie and leading to Attack of the Clones and stuff like that, there was like constant speculation about who Kitster might grow up to be. In fact, some people were contemplating that he might even be Boba Fett at some point. Do you ever follow any of those rumors or anything?
I didn't, but I always thought that Kitster was just a fun character. And I always did appreciate the fact that, people were trying to tie threads together, because that's definitely something that I always love to do myself. I just think that's so wizard.
Straight out of the movie. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's that scene, what is what it is, but it's followed up immediately with some more work being done on the pod, and Jar Jar is working on the engines. I don't know what qualification he has.
Exactly.
But someone decided it was a good idea to give him a wrench and let him do something. And while he's doing that, Anakin warns him about the binders, so that, if your hand touches that, it'll go numb for hours, as Anakin puts it. Well, Jar Jar promptly drops the wrench, leans over to pick it up, and then his mouth gets impacted by the binders, and more specifically his tongue. And my tongue is fat, is what he's saying there. And then he gets his hand stuck in the engine while he's doing it. It takes Padme to come help him out there. So I guess this is my invitation, Greg, to talk to you about Jar Jar. What did you think about him, and what do you think about him now?
I probably wouldn't have had, very nice things to say at the time, or I would have probably kind of, I think it's interesting when it hits you, because, it's close to 30, and, clearly Jar Jar was meant for kids, and, it kind of went over. I would say that, this was a lot more literally a lot more tongue in cheek. But it's a kind of a fun slapstick kind of one to look back now. And I think I'm more kind of impressed when Padme comes over and you see, because you're starting to try to figure out like what's CG, what's real, when she's trying to get him out of there. But yeah, I would say that, I certainly wasn't of that group that went online and hated on, the performance that was done. But yeah, it just didn't really hit me. And this is when you kind of clearly, Jar Jar was kind of clearly like, George was going for something. And, we weren't that 7 or 8 year old that probably, like anybody you talk to of that generation who were kids or younger, absolutely love it. And I'm like, that I think has been the biggest turnaround for me over the last several years, has been like, everybody's got their audience and people love these certain characters. And I dig the fact that people love them. And I like the fact that, that we've gotten Kelleran back, right? And we've gotten, this sort of appreciation, not only for Jar Jar, but for the actor as well, whose name just escapes me at the moment. I'm
Ahmed
sorry.
Best.
Thank you, Ahmed Best. I'm sitting there going like, why is it? This is why I'm old now, right? I throw some more characters out there. I'm like, give me a bunch of names. But
well, you threw Kelleran Beck in there, so I'm impressed. You got that one.
I'm like, I can dance around this one, but I'll just take it right on. I'll own it. I'll own it. But I just like the fact that how Ahmed has been embraced, and he's been able to come back and did the Young Jedi Adventures, and then taking that Kelleran Beck character into the Mandalorian, and now he's going to be doing some more stuff, and it's been really great, and to see like I said, these movies are released at different times and people are different ages when they pick them. And it's not always going to be just for the old fogies, right? Because we can barely remember who's in them. I clearly can tell you that, but it's fun. And now I can kind of appreciate what the performance is. I can appreciate, what Ahmed's doing there. And I can appreciate what Jar Jar is supposed to be doing in there. Even like I said, now you're kind of more looking at the effects the effects are okay there. But, they got better, but you're like, no, okay. But at any rate, it's a complicated feel. It's a complicated feel that you kind of sometimes have to kind of go back and kind of think and challenge yourself of like, why do I feel this way? How do I feel this way? And I'm saying like, okay, I wasn't crazy about him then. But over time, things change. My opinion changes.
Certainly. Yeah. As far as the effects go, it was groundbreaking for the time. It's not as impressive today by comparison to some of the things they've been able to do. Although I would say some of the CG has kind of suffered in movies in recent years due to overexertion of the artists, no fault of their own. But Jay, we've talked about Jar Jar a lot already here, but one of the things that kind of stands out to me, and I was thinking about him as I watched this segment, was he gets an opportunity to have an impact in the last act of this movie during the battle between the Gungans and the droids. And then when he comes up in the Attack of the Clones, he's the one that falls for the trap that Palpatine and his advisors, Moss Maiden and the like, kind of set for him to get him to propose the creation of a grand army of the Republic. And then he's largely forgotten about in Revenge of the Sith. To me, it feels like maybe George kind of lost with what he wanted to do with this character. He set him up as to be sympathetic, to be kind of oafish and clumsy in this movie, but then to have a moment of redemption later that I don't know that we actually get the payoff on that. But what do you think?
Well, for me, I know I've thought a lot about Jar Jar, and I've done, a blog even as far as defending him, if you will, with his whole personality and the way that he was kind of used as a scapegoat for a lot of different things, and he was used as a fall guy. And I think that he was originally intended, as you said, by George Lucas to be for kids. And I've come to the realization that when I first saw this movie, I took two little kids to see it. And very shortly thereafter, I had my own children. And so Jar Jar was a comic relief for them as well. So I think for George, maybe there was a point where as you said, his original intention for Jar Jar changed. And I'm wondering if that's because of the fact that he realized that the original intention maybe didn't resonate with people the way that he wanted it to, and it didn't sit with people the way that it was intended to. And so there was that evolution that was attempted to happen, but it never really truly, I don't think, gave Jar Jar enough credit, honestly. And that's sad in my opinion.
It's funny because I was thinking this the other day. It's like, had Jar Jar, if you dialed it back, either the accent or some of the blatant stuff, and I think I would like to in my own head think that had you kind of tweaked a little bit, like let's take it back from 11, Jar Jar could have been a hero of this movie and an endearing character, right? He's endearing now, but it was a hard road to get from there to here. But it would have been interesting to see, like, don't take him out of the scenes, but if you either change the dialect, see what he was going for, or just kind of write it so that children can glom onto them. But we also see him as like, that's really neat, because I do think there's this barrier to us where it's like, it's really jokey, and we're adults for serious Star Wars. But I think if he was able to straddle that line a little better, I would love to see. I would love to think that it would have turned out maybe a little differently. And I think you're right, Dennis. We would have gotten, you would have had the other two movies to really sew in some other things and maybe even make it a bit tragic, or maybe the character meets his demise or something like that. But it seems later, like you're right, Dennis, that he has to kind of, he has to really sprinkle it, not saute it, as it were.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. Okay, so the movie then moves on to the nighttime scene where Qui-Gon is cleaning a cut on Anakin's arm. He takes that opportunity to get a blood sample, but in the midst of this, Anakin asks about all the stars and whether they all have a system planets. Qui-Gon's response is that most of them do. And then Anakin wants to know if anyone's been to them all, and Qui-Gon's like, most likely not. And Anakin's like, well, I'm the first one to see them all. And meanwhile, Shmi's in the background, like chiding Anakin about getting to bed, despite the fact that he has a wound getting cleaned. And so, he is off to bed. And then Qui-Gon transmits whatever data he pulls from the blood sample over his, Gillette lady shaver to Obi-Wan for an analysis. And that's when he finds out the midi-chlorian counts through the roofs, over 20,000, higher than Yoda's. So we get a very methodical way of outlining how special Anakin is in this movie. It starts with him meeting them at Watto's junk shop, kind of developing a crush for Padme, then jumping in to save Jar Jar's skin, and then proposing to his mom and everybody else that he might be the solution to the problem, boasting about his force-sensitive abilities. And, well, not his force-sensitive abilities, but his ability to pod race, which piqued Qui-Gon's interest that he might have Jedi reflexes. And it keeps building and building and building, and now we get this confirmation about midi-chlorians. What do you think about midi-chlorians, Greg?
I think if you would have asked me in 1999, I was really not happy with them, because I liked some of the mystery of not knowing and seeing it how it was it was coming out as something clinical. Midi-chlorians plus Jar Jar make old Star Wars fan not happy. But I would say that it's interesting how they've kind of, especially with the M count stuff of the last, a couple of Disney Plus series, you start to go, okay, now it starts to kind of make sense. It was a long payoff, but I would say at the time I wasn't exactly thrilled with the explanation, but I see how it goes in the story as far as like, how are we going to kind of test him, as it were? There has to be something in there. But maybe it was the M count, but not so much I think when he starts to explain the beings and the symbiotes and things like that, and you're just kind of going, what? But then again,
right.
I'd had a lot to drink that night, so I really...
Well, and we get no explanation about what midi-chlorians even are in this scene. They're just, we know that he's got a really high number. It's over 20,000. Jay, what did you think about what do you think? What did you think then? What do you think now about midi-chlorians?
I mean, at the time, I was just like, oh, okay, that makes sense. I never really questioned it. And I guess I still don't see what the big deal is. And, Greg, as you said too, I mean, it just goes to show that the way that they've worked it in to the Bad Batch with the M counts and everything is it's just kind of part of Star Wars. So it never really bothered me, quite honestly. It was just like anything else that you could understand and identify that there was a reason why this existed. And I guess I just put two and two together, that when they were talking about, and Obi-Wan said that not even Master Yoda has a midi-chlorian count that high. I mean, you automatically knew that it was talking about the reference to the ability to wield the force, to use the force, to have the force within you or whatever. So it never really bothered me, quite honestly. And I will say that I reviewed the part of the novelization today before we recorded. And one of the things about the blood sample that they did talk about in there was that Qui-Gon smeared it onto something before he sent it to Obi-Wan. So for me, that makes more sense. It's almost like a pH strip or something, that if it reacts to something in a certain way, and then he's able to, send it that way for analysis based on the way that that little strip of paper or whatever reacted, then that I can understand.
Yeah. I'm with you, Greg, that I didn't need an explanation about why someone could be powerful with the Force. I like the mysteriousness of it all. But I can also appreciate the need for some sort of narrative explanation as to why Qui-Gon could be so certain that this kid's going to be powerful in the Force, because he could measure it this way. How else would he measure it? Anakin hasn't actually done anything in Qui-Gon's presence to prove that he has the ability to manipulate the Force. And the execution maybe just wasn't the best when it came down to it. I mean, midi-chlorians don't even really come out in Attack of the Clones or Revenge of the Sith. It's a convention that we talk about in the Phantom Menace, and it's got a purpose there. And then they kind of throw us a bone later when Anakin asks Qui-Gon about what midi-chlorians are. I was wondering, what are midi-chlorians? No one could deliver that line well when it comes down to it. But so it has its purpose. And again, as I was saying earlier, it's just kind of this buildup. We've been getting the suggestions that Anakin's special, that he has some abilities, and now we're telling about what his potential is in a way that we can comprehend, because we already know who Yoda is. And if he's got more midi-chlorians than Yoda, then wow, that's pretty special.
Right.
That being said, I wish they'd come up with some other way of doing it. I mean, I don't dislike midi-chlorians now, and it makes for a great bit of the mythology of Star Wars to use them in the Bad Batch and Ahsoka and things like that. But okay.
Well, it's interesting because you compare it. It's hard to compare it to Yoda in Empire Strikes Back, of how he's talking about the relationship. And you almost kind of wish that Qui-Gon, they had been able to write it so it had that sense of awe, especially when you're talking to a kid. And maybe it's just the way that Qui-Gon was working it in. And, the fact that maybe it doesn't come up for a while, maybe like Jar Jar, kind of like maybe George ended up kind of walking that back a bit, or maybe they thought, this is really clever, this is gonna hit, and maybe it doesn't. But I think when you go back and you hear Obi-Wan talk about it, or you hear Yoda, it Dagobah, you're going, I wish you could have said it like that you could have still maybe added some more to it, but just give it that gravitas that we go back and go, oh man, that's such a great scene where Qui-Gon's trying to explain the Force or how this works. But I get it,
Yeah,
I
not
often
everything
wonder
hits.
too, yeah, if it's just a product of the times. I mean, if you
Mm.
think about it, when The Empire Strikes Back was made, we're talking early 1980s. So we just got over, the hippie generation, and everything was just like peace, love, that kind of thing. And it was very mystical and very magical. And then you're talking about the late 1990s here, where there was a lot more technology, there was a lot more information-based kind of knowledge and that type of thing. So I'm wondering if it's, I maybe I'm overanalyzing it, but perhaps that just our culture at the time was sort of an influence on the way that the Force was interpreted.
That's a great point.
Yeah. All right. Well, then we get a shot of Darth Maul. He arrives at Tatooine in the Scimitar, and he lands, scans the horizon, and releases his Sith pro-droids to look for Jedi, to look for the Queen, because he's on the trail. Not a whole lot to the scene other than that, but again, gives me an opportunity. Greg, what are your thoughts on Darth Maul?
It's a shame this is the Maul I get for this podcast, because you're just sort of like, and then he shows up and he really whips around. He gets the goggles out and he's like going around, and then he finally locks in. And you're going, what do you think you're going to see with that thing up to your eyes? And you're doing like a 360 at at breakneck speed. But the ship was incredibly cool, and I think it's a nice entrance. And then he gets sort of these really mini little probe droids, and it does sort of add to the tension later that that other folks will get to really talk about the great scenes coming up. But in this case, it's nice to have him in there. And once again, going out to Ray Park for doing such a bang up job, because as we all proven, we wanted a lot more Maul, and we got a lot more Maul. So in that case, unlike Boss Nass, a lot of Maul goes a long way. Very little bit of Boss Nass goes a very long way. At any rate.
And here's where the novelization once again reminded me of the fact that there's this midichlorian connection, because when Maul is talking about releasing his probe droids, he says that he programmed them to specifically be able to hunt down Jedi Knights. So the only thing that I could
Mm.
think of was that these probe droids must have their like little, midi-chlorian hounds. They have a nose for that. So I had forgotten about that in the novel, and so I was glad that I reread it, because I was like, oh, there's kind of, they don't say it outright, but it's sort of a reference to midi-chlorian count.
Yeah.
Yeah, even if they would have brought up the fact of like, hey, there's more here than just the two Jedi, you know.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Greg, I'm sorry. You just didn't get any of the big action scenes in
Yeah.
this segment of the Phantom Menace, but I
Hey,
am
we get,
trying
we
to
get
do.
some dice rolling, man. That's that's what I came for.
Yes.
Yeah, but I do it. I don't not always done the best job of carving this movie up into these 10, 11-minute segments, but this is where this one ended. So we're here at the pod racer hangar, and the scene starts with Watto and Qui-Gon talking. Watto.
Qui-Gon.
Yeah, I like that one. New Jedi name. Watto demands Qui-Gon's ship the moment the race is over, and Qui-Gon is nonplussed by this, not even very surprised. And when he questions Watto about it, Watto says, hey, don't get me wrong, the boys are credit to your race, but I'm betting heavily on Sebulba. And then we get a shot of Sebulba. There's a couple of Twi'leks that are attending to him, and he thinks that Sebulba was going to win. And so Qui-Gon wants to get in on that action, and so he makes a bet that he'll bet his pod against Anakin and Shmi. To which Watto's response is, no pod is worth 2 slaves. And so they're going to throw the chance cube, and blue for Anakin, red for Shmi. Watto tosses it. You got to believe that had to be a loaded die. And Qui-Gon suspected that. He uses the Force and makes it land on blue for Anakin. Watto gets really annoyed with that. And, he says, this toss matters not, Outlander. You're going to lose a race, and you're going to lose you're going to lose. Okay. And we'll pick up the second half of the scene in just a second. I've got very mixed feelings about Watto between this movie and Attack of the Clones. But given what we have of him here, Greg, what do you think of him? I mean, because to me, he kind of seems to go from one moment where, okay, he's a slave owner, which is not good, but he does have a soft spot for Anakin. But then he does things like this. He sabotages his own guy.
Mhm.
So where do you land on him?
It was interesting, and like I said, going back to that deleted scene or the extended scene between the two of them, which I would say, like, if you have a copy that has the extra features on it, it's an interesting conversation, because it kind of goes back and forth, and you kind of understand, because it seems like it gets a little truncated. The conversation gets a little truncated, and he kind of really gets a little more upset, and you start to go, what? But I like Watto. I seem to remember liking the character. Then in Attack of the Clones, he does get kind of done a little dirty. But at this point, I guess he's lost. He bet heavy and he lost heavy. So there you go. But then at the end, he kind of jokes about it with Annie, like, "Hey, you better watch her. I'll end up pulling him too, right?" Oh, I shouldn't have gone back to the well on that one. But so yeah, it's interesting where he kind of like he has these little fits of anger. But yeah, it's once again, you're kind of keeping track, like, what's Qui-Gon betting on? All right, am I taking notes? Like, all right, if he does this, so it seems like it adds a little more complication to it. But yeah, it's sort of like, is the pod really worth a slave? I don't know what the conversion rate for slave and pod is.
It's a lot of who's the smartest guy in the room type of things here, as they're going back and forth trying to outsmart each other on this bet. But Jay, what's your take on all this?
Well, I've always loved Watto, and I've gone on record saying that several times. And I think he's just a product of his environment. I mean, he's gotten into this business. It's a cultural thing that slaves just exist on Tatooine, and so when he got into the business, that was just sort of what was expected of a business owner such as himself. And even though he has that soft spot for Anakin, I mean, at the end of the day, he still has to preserve his livelihood. And however he's going to do that, he's going to do that, whether that be through betting, through, slimy dealings or whatever. It's just sort of a survival of the fittest kind of thing on Tatooine.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I want to be careful not to compliment someone for being a kind slave owner. I mean,
Sure.
it's but I understand what you're saying. It is this is the environment. This is what goes on here, and this is a thing that happens. And so, okay, so we're dealing with, this is the story here. I don't find him to be cruel when it comes down to it. I think, as Shmi points out earlier in the movie, greed is the weakness here. Everything revolves around those awful races, as she puts it, and the gambling that goes on there. And so he is trying to outsmart everyone to make a huge pile of money. That is his weakness, and it gets the best of him here. And it costs him in a major way that he does not recover from, as we see in Attack of the Clones. So, I posed the question earlier kind of about Qui-Gon and this Jedi ethics that comes with him, because he's using the Force to get what he wants, or to achieve a desired outcome here. Now, no matter how noble the outcome, the question still sticks out to me: is that appropriate? Is that what's one supposed to do in this case? And he's, as we'll come to find out in this movie, he views Anakin as the chosen one, the prophet, the prophecy of the chosen one that comes in here. So he has no issue manipulating that die roll in order to get it to come up blue, so that and he believes Anakin's going to win, that he'll get Anakin freed, and it'll be for the greater good. But I don't know. I'm having a hard time articulating. There's something that sticks in my craw about just some of his methodology there, that it's the ends kind of justify the means. And he doesn't necessarily do a whole lot of things that are horrible, but he was willing to sack Watto with a currency that he couldn't use, that had no value, in order to get the parts he wanted earlier. And then when that didn't work, he engaged in an elaborate scheme to take advantage of Watto's greed. And then he takes advantage of Watto's greed again. And so, I mean, let's substitute a different word for greed. Something that, he takes advantage of his weakness here. And I don't know that Watto was necessarily that evil a character that we can excuse that. Okay, so there's my thesis. There's my explanation of it. Responses, Greg, what do you think?
Well, I mean, it does kind of play into, like, as we've been kind of finding out with the High Republic, and, as we kind of find over time, where it's like this is a period where the Jedi are at their peak. They're very arrogant. And so I think in some cases, as you say, Watto's kind of a product of his environment. I think, Qui-Gon's a product of his environment as well. The same thing, it kind of makes Dooku kind of like, I guess at the end of the day, justify what he does is, like it or not, you are a Jedi, you're kind of part of this, and really you're holding back, right? And so I do think that Qui-Gon, it even allows us, because there is that segment that kind of thinks that Shmi and Qui-Gon have a little thing going, and you kind of go, well, this kind of is the only way. This is kind of the door that could open up that conversation that does it, whatever, but still it's can you go, yeah, okay, I could kind of buy that a little bit, but I do kind of, it plays it in a little more subtly than, say, when you go back to the council and you see them there, and how Lucas has Mace Windu and them sort of like, oh really, this is a little more of an arrogance on a little more nuance, I guess. So I think, had the council been kind of done a little way that way, a little less overt and more, I'm picking up the sarcasm, but you're not laying it down too thick. That's where I don't necessarily have a problem with Qui-Gon there. And like I said, you're out in this, we're going to Jedi a little differently out here. We're going to take care of things
out on the range. Yes.
And remember, Watto later sells Shmi to Klieg. So, had me back when we were doing Attack of the Clones at 25, right? Let's put a bookmark in that one.
Absolutely. And we will definitely be doing that.
What do you think of that, Jay?
Well, again, it's one of those things where you could justify just about anything with any kind of reason. But that's one of the reasons why I love doing these segments, is just getting to hear everybody else's points of view on things. And it really does make me think, what is the motivation? What is the underlying reason? And, I think at the end of the day, it's just that's part of the discourse. That's part of the reason why we are still talking about this movie 25 years later, is maybe we'll never really come to a conclusion as to why things happened the way that they did. So, yeah, I mean, I'm just gonna leave it at that, quite honestly.
Okay. Okay. Well,
Kind of a
I'm sure
cop
this is
out, I know, but
no. Well, I'm sure this is not the last time I'm going to bring this up as we work our way through the rest of this
Sure.
movie in future
Mhm.
segments. But so stick a pin in that. Okay. So Anakin and Padme ride in on one Yopi and Shmi and Kister on another. They're pulling the engines behind them. And then R2 and 3PO stride into the hangar, pulling in the pod itself. Watto strides up to Anakin and says, you better stop your friend from gambling or I'm going to end up owning him too. And then Anakin's like, well, what was all that about? And Qui-Gon's like, oh, ask me later. And then he has to your point, Greg, he, very pleasant good morning to Shmi. And then 3PO
Hmm.
makes a comment about space travel. He's never going to get involved in any one of those dreaded starships. Then we have a comment from Kitster that this is so wizard. And he tells Anakin he's sure he's going to do it this time. And Padme is like, do what? And he's like, well, finish the race, of course. And so she's like, you've never won a race, not even finished. So she's very, very taken aback by that. So, the thing we don't see here is the aftermath, which will come in our next segment, where Padme is beside herself telling Qui-Gon, it's like, you Jedi are way too reckless here. But what about this revelation, Greg? What do you think about it?
Oh, it's funny because now, of course, it's sort of like the line "This is so wizard" as opposed to the dreadful starship ones. It's like the one line, "This is so wizard" is I find a lot funnier and better than Anthony Daniels' line, where I'm like, boy, you could have left that one out or something else, because that was a little ugh. But yeah, I do think it just ratchets up the tension a little bit. And, I do like that. What do you mean you haven't, like so much won but finished? And you're like, okay, that's going to add it. And it's really going to like, oh man, he hasn't even finished a race yet. And so I think it's a nice little setup for the next segment.
Oh yeah. And Natalie Portman just delivers this so well. I mean, her face, the way that her jaw just drops open and she's just looking up out of the lids, of her eyes. It just reminds me of teaching teenagers, and you've got this young 14-year-old who just had her friend drop the most vicious tea on her ever. And just this unbelievability in her face. But I mean, she was just mortified because she thought, "Oh my gosh, he's never even finished her race. What
Mm-hmm.
the heck are we doing here?"
Yeah, because she's already not excited about this plan.
Right, yeah.
And then now, but wait, it gets worse.
Mhm.
So, okay. Well, then the last thing we see in this segment is the probe droid flying through the streets of Mos Espa, looking for Jedi, looking for the Queen. And then I never get enough of this. You see that one alien that's kind of in the spacesuit, and he's clearly having a conversation, but there's no one next to him. They
Right.
digitally removed that character, despite the fact that we see these two wandering around together in earlier shots in the movie in Mos Espa. This is not the first time we see them. I still don't know why they entirely removed this character, but I don't know. It just makes me laugh every time I see it.
And I want to say that, on the tech side, I think that's Alex Lindsay, who he does, he is on, like, if you listen to like This Weekend, the Leo Laporte family of podcasts, he's a big Mac guy. And this week, Mac Break Weekly has been something, and he worked for Lucasfilm and helped do a lot of the work on Amidala's ship. And so a lot of those extras would end up, as we find, some of them more well-known than others, but I think that's his character. And I remember over the years him talking about it, like even somebody made him like a modded action figure. But I think that's him, because you see him earlier in one. But now I kind of joke every time I see it, because I'm like, oh, there's Alex Lindsay's character in it. But anyway, but that's, like I said, it's another whole podcast silo over there. But at any rate.
All right. Well, before we wrap this up, did either one of you have any observations about this segment before we end it?
It was kind of fun to kind of go back because a lot of times you could say, yeah, obviously the pod race and some of these other like touchstone action sequences are always kind of fun to chew. But I think these moments in between, I enjoyed going over this segment, and I enjoyed kind of the assignment of it because you do kind of look for, and sometimes you get a chance to kind of sit there and go, okay, what were they trying for here? Did it work? Did it not work? And so it was a fun segment to go over. And yeah, the pod race is just something I remember enjoying the sound of those pods as they go through the canes and so forth. I remember loving it then. I like that whole pod race, still do. So even though I know some people are like, oh, with the sound and stuff, but he got it. He got his race. George Lucas did. So it's going to be fun, and I'll be curious who you pull in for that one.
Did you get an opportunity to see Phantom Menace on the re-release recently?
Yes, I got to go see it myself, and then the next day dragged the family. So it was nice because I had been only married for about a year, and so and my kids obviously were not born yet. So to have the whole family there and see their reaction to certain things, and some things hit better than others, but it was still fun to kind of see, because I do think I remember taking my wife to at least one of the screenings that I was very much more sober for. But at any rate, but. Yeah, it was fun. It was nice to see everybody kind of go, hey, I'm going to go see this, or you see them taking the family too. So it was great to kind of have that opportunity to go back to the theater and then visit it with family. So
yeah, well, the reason why I asked is just, for me, the Phantom Menace on the big screen is a different experience than watching it on your television. I don't care how good your screen is, what your sound is like and stuff, but getting a theater with great surround sound and getting that big screen feel for that pod race just absolutely enhances the experience in a way that you can't adequately explain. So Jay, you have any other final thoughts?
No, actually, I think we're good. Greg summed it up wonderfully there, honestly.
Well, with that then, hey, Greg, thanks so much for coming back. You were the perfect guy for this segment. I'm so glad that you were able to make it here. We enjoy your work on Rebel Base Card, and I appreciate everything you do for the Star Wars podcast community there and what you've been able to contribute here. But before you go, you want to remind everybody once again where they can find Rebel Base Card and what's going on there.
Oh, and thank you for having me on again. I love Podcast Stardust, and I love the dynamic you two have, and just the consistency of the product and your schedule. So however you do it, dogs, don't worry about the dogs. The dogs are great.
Well, thank you.
But yeah, you can find me usually during the day. I'm in and out of Twitter, X, or it started on Instagram, so I still post there a lot of times as well. And usually I do a lot of cross posting on Threads and Blue Sky. On your podcatcher, whether you have Apple Podcasts or Spotify or whatnot, the two of the bigger platforms, you can look for the Rebel Base Card podcast, and you will find me there. And still kind of chugging along into year 6. We passed year 5, I want to say a couple months ago, and it's kind of fun because some other pods, like we're kind of that 2019 celebration generation, and so it's kind of fun that everybody who's still kind of going. I'm rooting for everybody, so it's kind of fun. But talking cards, talking collecting, talking Acolyte real soon, and I promise, Tales of the Empire. You will get both. I promise you, at some point, you will get the second half of that. Looking forward to talking about that as well.
All right. Well, thanks again.
Yes, thanks, Greg.
All right, there you have it. That was our discussion with Greg McLaughlin from the Rebel Base Card, and it's always fun to have him on the show. This is our second time I've been on other podcasts with him, and I've been on Rebel Base Card as a guest and stuff like that. And it's always an enjoyable experience. He's got a great perspective and a great way of saying things and a wonderful sense of humor.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, his personality really makes it a lot of fun. And, even though he didn't have a whole lot of action to talk about, we did get a chance to really dive into some of those, lingering questions and burning things that have been going on in the fandom for 25 years. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Planted some seeds for a future podcast, I think.
Indeed.
So we'll have to pick up some of those threads later.
Yes.
All right. Well, then, I'd like to thank you all for joining us for this episode of Podcast Stardust and our discussion of the Phantom Menace. We hope you've enjoyed it. And if you did, make sure to hit that subscribe button on your podcatcher choice, and then the future entries in this series will get downloaded to your device automatically. I'd also like to remind you can find the entire catalog of Podcast Stardust over on retrozap.com. which is home to several other great podcasts covering everything from the MCU and DC to Dune, Star Trek, and a whole lot more. As always, we greatly appreciate your 5-star ratings and reviews. That's the algorithm driver out there for helping podcasts get noticed. And so wherever you listen to this, if they support ratings and reviews, we'd love it if you'd leave us one. And if it's not Apple Podcasts, send us an email with a link to your review, and I'd love to read it on the show. We love that type of feedback. And while we're on the topic of feedback, please share the show and your favorite episodes on social media with your friends. That's a great way to spread the word as well. So with all those things in mind, Jay, remind everybody what our social media contacts are one more time.
You got it, Dennis. We are very easily found on Facebook, Instagram, and X at Podcast Stardust. And as Dennis was mentioning, you can also find us on basically every streaming platform. And I know that Spotify does support reviews, and that's a huge platform that a lot of people listen to, as well as YouTube Music and YouTube. So if you are privy to both of those, then you can head over to both of those, like and subscribe and share those out as well. And if you'd like to interact with us in real time, you can head over to the RetroZap Discord room, which is part of that RetroZap Discord server. And if you'd like to do that, just hit up the link in our show notes. And we also have a TeePublic store where you can pick up one of 7 different show logo designs available on all kinds of great Podcast Stardust swag. So if you're in need of a t-shirt, sweatshirt, coffee mug, or some home goods, head over to, once again, that link in our show notes, and it'll take you right to where you need to go. And you can also help out the show by picking up a new lightsaber if you are in the market. Why not 2? So at sabermasters.com, you can pick up the Ultimate Lightsaber 2.0, as well as check out their wide array of other battle-ready lightsabers that they have for sale over there. And they really are amazing quality battle-ready sabers. So if you head to sabermasters.com, you can check out all of the things that they have to offer. And if you do happen to get something, make sure you put in the code STARDUST at checkout, and you'll get an extra $10 off. So again, that is at sabermasters.com. So with that, Dennis, what else you got going on with podcasting right now?
So my wife and I have been talking about the 5th and final season of Star Trek Discovery over on our Star Trek podcast, which is Warp Trails. That's an exclusive podcast to the RetroZap podcast feed. We've fallen a little bit behind on that right now, and so we're trying to figure out how to catch up on that. But you'll be able to find the last few episodes covering the end of the season at some point this summer. But we've committed to doing it, and we will do it. But if you want to hear what we had to say about previous season Discovery or Picard, Lower Decks, and Strange New Worlds, then look for the RetroZap podcast feed on your podcast of choice. The best place might at this point be just to head to retrozap.com. Jay, what do you got in the way of updates in the world of cosplay?
All right. Well, you can always find me on my Instagram, which is at j.snipscosplay. And just want to welcome all the new followers over there as well. So that community continues to keep growing. And I do have a meetup with Vanessa Marshall on June 1st at the Medina County Fairgrounds here in Ohio for the Medina County Toy and Collectors Fair. And I say meetup because unfortunately I'm not going to be able to cosplay that day. I have lots of graduation parties, so I'm trying to squeeze that in. Just got the invites. And so, but I will be there. And I am also as Ahsoka, the fourth sister, Hera, 2 different versions, as well as my original concept Mandalorian over there on my Instagram. So come on over, have some fun interacting at j.snipscosplay.
Upcoming on the show on Friday, we are going to start getting into some episodes that we recorded well in advance. I'm going to be taking some vacation, but we're not leaving you all high and dry without a podcast. And it's what's funny is that was recorded these. I had no idea what was coming and when. But on Friday, we've got a special episode with a special guest discussing movies that are currently in production. And we talk about what we're looking forward to. And then on Monday, we have a discussion of Star Wars shows, past, present, and future on Disney+. There's a few developments that happened since we recorded that show, so not everything's going to be up to date. But it's a fun discussion nonetheless. So be on the lookout for that. With that having been said, thanks for listening to episode 735 of Podcast Stardust. Have a great rest of your week, a great beginning of summer, and until next time, may the Force be